Around 6:30 inches the evening on the 10th of December 1991, a 22-year-old security guard named Brian Ruff was sitting inside a small guard shack at the Kenotok copper mine in northern Utah. He had a college textbook open in front of him, trying to study. The shack he was in was tiny, barely big enough for one person, with windows on all four sides. And when Brian looked out of those windows, all he saw was darkness. The sun had set a while ago, and this part of the mine was completely isolated. There were no streetlights, no other buildings nearby. The only light came from the moon reflecting off the fresh snow on the ground, which made everything outside look kind of eerie and desolate. Brian had been a security guard at this mine for just over a year, but he'd only been assigned to this specific guard shack for a couple of weeks. And in his opinion, it was the absolute worst post he could have possibly gotten. His job was to stand guard at a chain-link gate that blocked off a remote service road leading deep into the canyons. Because it was such an out-of-the-way entrance to the mine, almost no vehicles ever came through. So most of the time, the job was just incredibly boring. He would just sit there for hours watching the snowfall. But at the same time, it was also a very dangerous post. The Kennecott copper mine was famous. People called it the richest hole on Earth because of the massive amounts of copper, gold, and silver buried in the ground there. And all that valuable material made the mine a huge target for thieves. In just the last few months alone, over $150,000 worth of equipment and precious metals had been stolen. So Brian was always a little on edge out here, all by himself in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't just the pitch blackness that got to him. It was also the fact that he was totally unarmed. The company didn't provide guards with any weapons. He didn't even have security cameras. If he ran into a group of thieves, his only defense was a telephone on his desk to call for help. But on this particular night, his shift had been completely normal. It was slow, quiet, and uneventful. So Brian decided to use the downtime to get some studying in. He was in nursing school, and his final exams were just a few days away. He was poring over his notes and textbooks, trying to cram as much information as he could into his head. While he was studying, he took out a thermos. His wife had packed him some soup for dinner. He unscrewed the lid, and just as he was about to take his first spoonful, the phone on his desk started ringing. Brian immediately hesitated. He knew there was a very good chance it was his wife Jennifer on the other end. But things at home right now were not great. Jennifer worked as a nurse's aide, and Brian had taken on this night shift at the mine to help pay the bills while he was in nursing school during the day. But even with both of them working, money was incredibly tight. And to make things even more stressful, Jennifer was pregnant with their second child. The pressure of balancing school, work, and raising a family had been putting a huge strain on their marriage. About a month ago, Brian had hit a breaking point. He'd actually walked out on his family. He left a simple note for Jennifer, saying he just needed some time alone to think things over. Then he drove to the mine, turned in his security badge, and told his boss he was quitting. After that, he just left town. He spent almost a week in Las Vegas, and then he drove all the way out to San Francisco. He was trying to clear his head, but while he was out there, he got a call. His daughter, back home in Utah, was in the emergency room with a bad case of pneumonia. For Brian, that was the wake-up call he needed. He realized he couldn't live with himself if he actually abandoned his family for good. So he immediately got in his car and drove straight back to Utah to be with Jennifer and his daughter. His daughter, thankfully, made a full recovery. And Jennifer, despite him just up and leaving them, she agreed to take him back. But just because he was home didn't mean things went back to normal. There was this constant tension hanging over their relationship. Jennifer hadn't fully forgiven him for what he'd done, and Brian felt like he was walking on eggshells all the time. So now, sitting in the guard shack, Brian took a deep breath before picking up the ringing phone. It was Jennifer. He chatted with her for a few minutes, trying to keep the conversation light. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something through the window. It was a flash of headlights, coming up the service road directly towards his guard shack. He told Jennifer he had to go, hung up the phone, and stepped outside to meet the vehicle that was pulling up. About an hour and a half later, around 8 p.m., Brian's boss, a supervisor named Todd Fallows, pulled up to the gate next to the guard shack. He noticed the lights were on inside the shack, but he couldn't see anyone moving around in there. Todd thought this was pretty strange. Brian was under strict orders not to leave his post for any reason. That was the most important rule of the job. You stay put, no matter what. What made it even weirder was that Brian's car was parked right next to the shack. This post was so far away from anything else on the mine property, there was literally nowhere for Brian to go without his car, especially not in the freezing cold. So where was he? Todd was starting to feel a little uneasy. He parked his own vehicle, got out, and walked over to the shack. He opened the door and stepped inside. The tiny space was empty. Brian was gone. But on the desk, Todd saw Brian's hat and his half-eaten thermos of soup. It looked like he had just gotten up and walked away in the middle of his dinner. At this point, Todd knew something was wrong. He picked up the phone inside the shack and called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Department to report a missing person. Less than an hour later, Detective Manny Lassig was driving down a dark, snowy desert road heading towards the Kennetock copper mine. Everyone in law enforcement knew this mine was a hotbed for theft. So, when the sheriff's department got a call that a security guard had vanished in the middle of his shift, Detective Lassig didn't waste any time. The first thought was that this could be related to thieves. Maybe they had kidnapped Brian, or worse. When Lassig pulled up to the main entrance of the mine, he saw another vehicle parked there. It flashed its headlights at him. A man in a security guard uniform rolled down his window and waved Lassig over. Lassig pulled up alongside him, and the man introduced himself as Todd Fallows, the supervisor who had made the call about the missing guard. Todd started his engine and told Lassig to follow him. And so Lassig did. He followed Todd's taillights deeper into the darkness, down a winding road that led into the canyons. The Kennetock mine was huge, covering 3 square miles of rocky, mountainous terrain. They drove for a solid 10 minutes before Lassig finally saw a single light up ahead. It was the guard shack where Brian had been stationed. The two men parked their cars and got out. Todd pointed to the shack and told Detective Lassig that this was where Brian was supposed to be. Lassig pulled out a flashlight and aimed it at the ground around the shack, but there wasn't much to see. It had been snowing all evening, so any potential footprints or tire tracks were already covered up. So, Lassig stepped inside the shack. At first glance, everything looked normal. There was no blood, nothing was knocked over, no signs of any kind of struggle. But there on the desk was Brian's hat and that half-eaten thermos of soup. It was a strange little detail that just didn't feel right. Lassig was trying to process the scene, running through different theories in his head, looking for any clue about what might have happened. As he was thinking, the phone on the desk rang again. Detective Lassig just picked it up. He answered, and a woman on the other end sounded surprised. She said her name was Jennifer Ruff, and she was trying to call her husband Brian. Lassig quickly explained that he was with the sheriff's department and that her husband had left his post sometime during the night and couldn't be found. He was literally in the middle of investigating his disappearance. He then asked Jennifer when she had last spoken to Brian. Jennifer, obviously shocked by the news, told him she had just talked to him a couple of hours ago. She said they were on the phone and then Brian suddenly had to hang up because he saw a car approaching the shack. Lassig asked her if Brian had said anything specific about the car or who might be driving it. But Jennifer said no. He just said a car was coming and he had to go. Lassig was a bit disappointed there wasn't more information, but he thanked Jennifer and promised to be in touch as soon as he knew anything. He hung up the phone and turned his attention back to the tiny room. But just a few seconds later, the phone rang again. Lassig picked it up. And again, a woman on the line said she was Brian's wife, Jennifer, and she was asking where he was. But as Lassig was listening, he realized something was very wrong. This woman's voice sounded nothing like the woman he had just spoken to a minute ago, who had also claimed to be Jennifer. And this second woman clearly had no idea about their previous conversation. He was talking to two different people, both of them claiming to be Brian Ruff's wife. Obviously, only one of them could be telling the truth, which meant one of these women had to be lying. A few days later, in mid-December of 1991, Detective Manny Lassig was sitting at the dining room table in the Ruffs' home. He had a cup of coffee in his hand and was sitting across from Brian's wife, Jennifer. Brian was still missing, and the investigation had been moving at a snail's pace. For the first few days, everyone was kind of hoping that Brian would just show up on his own, that maybe he had run off again like he had before. But as the days turned into a week, that seemed less and less likely. By now, Detective Lassig had traced the phone numbers of both women who had called the guard shack that night. He quickly confirmed that one of the calls had come from Jennifer Ruff's work phone number. So, he was pretty sure he was now sitting with the real Jennifer Ruff. But he was still trying to figure out why another woman would call and impersonate her. And the timing of the calls was just too strange to be a coincidence. One right after the other. It was bizarre. So, as Lassig sat across from Jennifer, he started by asking her for her alibi. Where had she been on the night Brian disappeared? She told him she had been at the hospital all night, working a long shift. She even gave Lassig the names of several of her coworkers who could back up her story. Then, Lassig changed the subject completely. He looked her in the eye and asked her, point blank, if there was any chance her husband could have been having an affair. Were there other women in his life? Had he been acting strange or secretive lately? The reason he asked, of course, was because of that second mysterious phone call. He knew there was another woman out there, even if Jennifer didn't. When Jennifer heard the question, she looked down at the table for a moment. Then she looked back up at him and said, yes, she was suspicious of that. She told Lassig all about the problems they'd been having in their marriage. She told him how, just the month before, Brian had suddenly run off, saying he needed time alone. He was gone for a week with no contact, until he just showed up again, begging her to take him back. When Lassig heard that, he leaned back in his chair. He started to wonder if this whole investigation was a waste of time. If Brian had a history of just taking off without warning, what was to stop him from doing it again? Maybe this wasn't a crime at all. Maybe Brian would just turn up in a few days, just like last time. But Jennifer must have sensed what he was thinking, because she quickly added that the first time he left, he had at least left a note. And he'd told his boss he was quitting. There was some kind of warning. She insisted that it was not like Brian to just vanish in the middle of his shift like this, leaving his dinner half-eaten. He had his faults, she said, but this was different. Detective Lassig asked Jennifer if she knew where Brian had gone during that week he was away. In response, Jennifer got up and handed him a piece of mail from a nearby table. It was a credit card bill that had arrived that week, addressed to Brian. She explained she was confused when she saw it because, as far as she knew, Brian didn't even have a credit card. But apparently he did, and he had used it a lot while he was gone to pay for hotels, meals, and other things. Lassig took the bill and started looking it over. He saw a lot of charges from Las Vegas and San Francisco, and the amounts for restaurant meals and room service seemed a little high for just one person. He looked up from the bill at Jennifer, and he could tell from the look on her face that they had both come to the same conclusion. When Brian was away that week, he probably hadn't been alone. Jennifer then handed Lassig another piece of paper. It was their phone bill, with a detailed list of every call made and received over the past month. Jennifer said there were a bunch of numbers on the list that she didn't recognize. She thought maybe one of them belonged to the person Brian had been traveling with. As Lassig looked over the list of numbers, one of them immediately jumped out at him. It was the same number that the second woman, the fake Jennifer, had called from on the night Brian disappeared. Later that same day, Lassig was sitting in the living room of the house associated with that phone number. Across from him was a young woman named Christy Bradley. Her husband, Dale Bradley, was also a security guard at the Kenotok mine, the same place Brian worked. Dale wasn't home at the moment, and Lassig wanted to talk to Christy alone before he got back. So, he didn't beat around the bush. He told Christy that he was almost certain she and Brian had been having an affair. Before she could even respond, he pulled out the credit card bill Jennifer had given him and showed her the evidence. For a second, Christy looked like she was going to deny it. But then her face crumbled and she broke down and admitted everything. She said she and Brian had been seeing each other for a while. She confirmed that they had run away together the month before for about a week. And even though they had both come back to their families, she said they were still very much in touch. She said that's why she had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared. She was just calling to talk to him. But when a strange man's voice answered the phone, Detective Lassig, she said she panicked. On instinct, she just lied and pretended to be Jennifer, his wife, so that their affair wouldn't be discovered. But she was very clear about one thing. She hadn't heard from Brian since that night, and she had no idea what happened to him. Lassig sat back and just watched her for a moment. She seemed genuinely worried about Brian. And even though her call to the guard shack was incredibly suspicious, her explanation for it actually made a twisted kind of sense. Still, he wasn't about to rule her out as a suspect just yet. And now her husband Dale was also a primary suspect. If he had found out about his wife's affair with his friend and coworker, he would have a powerful motive for revenge. The next day, Lassig walked into an interrogation room at the sheriff's station. Dale Bradley was already sitting there, waiting for him. The moment Lassig came in, Dale asked if there was any news about Brian. Lassig said no, not yet. And to Lassig, Dale's concern seemed real. He sat down and asked Dale how long he'd known Brian. Dale said they'd met about a year ago when Brian started working at the mine, and they had become pretty good friends. They even hung out together outside of work sometimes. Then, trying to catch him off guard, Lassig abruptly changed the subject and asked Dale directly about his wife's affair with Brian. Dale looked completely stunned. He said he didn't know anything about Christy having an affair. Lassig explained what his wife had already confessed to. Dale seemed genuinely devastated. The idea that his wife was cheating on him, especially with a man he considered a close friend, was clearly a huge shock. As Dale was trying to process this, Lassig asked him where he was on the night of December 10th when Brian disappeared. Dale, still reeling from the news, took a moment to compose himself. He said that on that night his car had actually gotten stuck in the snow. He was at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, which was almost an hour's drive from the mine. He said he even had to call a friend to come and pull his car out of the snowbank, and then he gave Lassig the friend's name so he could verify the story. After writing down the name, Lassig told Dale he wanted him to take a polygraph test. He also said they would need to search his car. Dale agreed to both requests without any hesitation at all. A few weeks later, Lassig was walking across the parking lot at the Kennetock mine. Brian still hadn't been found, and the investigation felt like it was hitting one dead end after another. Dale Bradley and his wife Christy had both taken polygraph tests, and they had both passed. Lassig had also searched Dale's red Mustang, but he found no evidence inside that connected him to Brian's disappearance. On top of that, the friend Dale mentioned had confirmed his story. He said yes, he had gone to help Dale get his Mustang out of the snow that night. So, Dale's alibi seemed solid. At that point, both Dale and Christy were unofficially moved off the suspect list. Lassig had also considered the possibility that Jennifer, Brian's actual wife, might have been involved. Her coworkers confirmed she was at work all evening on the night Brian disappeared, but it wasn't impossible that she had hired someone to harm Brian. She certainly had a motive. But with no evidence against her and still no body, all Lassig had was a gut feeling, and that wasn't enough. But then, just a few days ago, Lassig got a new lead that sent the investigation in a completely new direction. That's why he was back at the Kennetock mine to talk to Brian's supervisor, Todd Fallows, again. Lassig went into the office building and found Todd's office. When Todd saw him, he jumped up from his desk and eagerly greeted him, saying he would do anything he could to help find Brian. Lassig thanked him, but told him to sit back down. Then, Lassig sat down, pulled out a tape recorder, and hit the record button. He then told Todd why he was really there. Two of Brian's fellow security guards had just been arrested for stealing precious metals and equipment from the mine and selling it all at local pawn shops. An internal investigation had uncovered a whole ring of employees who were involved in the thefts. Todd started to look nervous. He shifted in his chair and said he had heard about that, but he insisted he had nothing to do with it. He said he'd already been questioned by detectives from the Property Crimes Division. Lassig said he knew that, and that wasn't why he was there. He explained that when he reviewed the records from the theft investigation, he discovered that Brian had been the one who had reported some of his coworkers for stealing. So now, Lassig had a new theory. What if, on the night he disappeared, Brian had stopped a coworker's car, found stolen materials inside, and they had killed him to silence him? Todd leaned back in his chair, looking thoughtful for a moment. Then he admitted that, yeah, that was possible. He then started telling Detective Lassig about several places on the mine's property where a body could be hidden. As an example, he suggested the giant gravel pile by the concentrator, a machine that crushes minerals and grinds them into dust. Todd explained that if Brian's body had been placed there, it would have been sucked into the grinders and pulverized along with the rocks. He would be completely gone. Detective Lassig was taken aback by how specific Todd was being. It was like he had already thought about this in great detail. Sensing something was off, Lassig just let Todd keep talking. And Todd did. He kept offering up one gruesome theory after another about what could have happened to Brian. At one point, he suggested Brian could have been hidden under the waste piles, where weeks' worth of crushed boulders would have already fallen on top of him, burying him completely. He said if that happened, Brian would be under several tons of rock by now, and the police would never, ever find him. On the 10th of July, 1993, a full year and a half after Brian Ruff disappeared, Detective Lassig was driving through a barren stretch of desert in Utah, about 50 miles south of the Kennetock mine. There had been absolutely no progress on the case for over a year. The sheriff's department had spent countless hours searching the mine with police dogs and helicopters looking for any sign of Brian. But they had found nothing. Not a single trace. By this point, Lassig was sure that foul play was involved. But it was impossible to prove a murder without a body and without any evidence tying his suspects to the crime. For months, his team had investigated every single security guard at the mine, especially the ones involved in the theft ring. But they had verified that every guard who was on duty that night was at their assigned post when Brian vanished. And they had checked the alibis of everyone who wasn't scheduled to work. They couldn't link a single one of them to Brian's disappearance. That included his supervisor, Todd Fallows, who, despite his strangely specific theories, was eventually linked to the theft ring, but had a solid alibi for the night of the murder. As for Christy Bradley, the woman Brian was having an affair with, and her husband Dale, they had been ruled out early on. Their alibis checked out, they passed lie detector tests, and nothing new had come up in the last year and a half to make them suspects again. And Brian's wife, Jennifer, also remained off the list. She had a strong motive, but her alibi of being at work was airtight, and they could find no connection between her and any possible accomplice. So after more than a year of dead ends, the case had gone completely cold. But that morning, the investigation had suddenly come back to life. A group of campers had called the sheriff's department to report finding skeletal remains out in the desert. Lassig knew it was a long shot, but he was hoping it might be Brian. When he arrived at the location the campers had described, he got out of his car and walked across the dry, cracked earth to where a forensics team was setting up crime scene tape in the brush. As Lassig got closer, he could see a human skeleton lying in a shallow, makeshift grave. The skeleton was still wearing clothes, a dust-covered dark blue jacket. Lassig crouched down to get a better look, and he saw that it was a security guard's uniform. He put on a pair of gloves and carefully searched the pockets of the jacket. His fingers closed around a wallet. He pulled it out, opened it, and found an ID card and credit cards, all with the name Brian Ruff. It seemed clear that this was Brian's body. But because it was so decomposed, they would need to check dental records to be 100% sure, and that would take some time. While the crime scene techs carefully removed the remains, Lassig stayed behind with a K9 unit to search the area for any other evidence. And sure enough, just a few feet away from the grave, Lassig found 5 shotgun shells scattered in the dirt. It looked like Brian had been shot 5 times and then buried. Then, a few yards away from the shells, a police dog started barking. An officer called Lassig over. The officer was holding up a black work boot. There was a clear bullet hole right through the leather. Lassig was sure the boot had to be Brian's. But aside from the body and the boot, 18 months of brutal desert weather, scorching heat, wind, sand, snow, and rain had erased almost every other trace of forensic evidence. So even though Lassig now knew where and how Brian had been killed, he was worried he was no closer to figuring out who had done it. 12 years passed. On the 30th of April, 2005, Detective Todd Park of the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office received a phone call. Park had been assigned to the cold case unit at the beginning of the year, and his full-time job was to solve old, forgotten crimes. The detective on the phone was from the sheriff's department in the next county over. He was investigating a recent homicide, and he thought it might be connected to one of Park's cold cases. Specifically, the murder of Brian Ruff. After the call, Park hung up the phone and went straight to his filing cabinet. He dug through the old dusty files until he found the one for Brian Ruff. He sat down at his desk and began sorting through the stacks of decade-old papers. And as he read, he noticed a tiny piece of evidence that the original investigators had somehow overlooked. And upon closer examination, Park realized this small detail was the key to unlocking the entire case. Based on all the forensic evidence, this is what police now believe happened to Brian Ruff on the night of the 10th of December, 1991. Around 6:30 p.m., the killer drove down that dark, winding service road toward the isolated part of the Kennetock mine. Up ahead, they saw the single light from Brian's small guard shack. The killer pulled their car right up to the shack and parked. When they got out, Brian came out of the shack to see who it was. He waved hello. The killer waved back and walked towards Brian. And as soon as they were close enough, they grabbed Brian, spun him around, and tied his hands behind his back. Before Brian could even react, the killer forced him into the back of their vehicle. The killer then got into the driver's seat, made a U-turn, and sped away from the mine, heading out towards the desert. As they drove, Brian was screaming and kicking in the back, trying desperately to escape. But the killer remained calm and just kept driving for nearly an hour until they reached another remote spot deep in the desert, about 50 miles away from the mine. They pulled off the road and stopped in an open, snow-covered patch of land. The killer got out, opened the back door, and dragged Brian out of the car. Brian was still fighting, but he was exhausted. He started pleading for his life, promising that if they just let him go, he would never tell anyone what had happened. But the killer wasn't listening. They grabbed a shovel and a shotgun from their vehicle, untied Brian, and then, at gunpoint, forced him to dig his own grave in the frozen ground. When Brian was finished, the killer raised the shotgun and shot him 5 times. After Brian was dead, they pushed his body into the hole he had just dug. The killer then got back into their car, a red Mustang. But when they tried to drive away, the Mustang's tires spun in the snow. They were stuck. So, they had to make a phone call to a friend for help. The friend came out, having no idea that a murder had just been committed only a few feet away, and helped the killer get their car out of the snow. And then, the killer drove off into the night. The killer was Dale Bradley, the coworker whose wife Brian was having an affair with. Dale's alibi that his car had gotten stuck in the snow an hour away from the mine was true. But it wasn't an alibi. It was a confession. He was describing being stuck at the crime scene. The friend who came to help him was telling the truth when he confirmed the story to the police, but he had no idea he was helping a murderer flee the scene of the crime. The police never cross-referenced the location where Dale said he was stuck with the location where Brian's body was eventually found. And so, they mistakenly believed his story. Additionally, Dale had passed a polygraph test early in the investigation, which made him seem even less like a suspect. He and Christy eventually divorced, likely because of the affair, and Dale later remarried. But in 2005, when his second wife, Crystal, was murdered, the detective investigating her case noticed that Dale Bradley had now been close to two different people who had been murdered. He thought it was too much of a coincidence, so he called Detective Park, the cold case investigator. That phone call prompted Detective Park to take a fresh look at the entire Brian Ruff case file. And that's when he found the note about the tiny speck of red paint found on the sole of the black work boot that was discovered near Brian's body. Park had the paint speck reanalyzed, and he was able to match it perfectly to the paint on the inside of the trunk of Dale Bradley's red Mustang. Dale Bradley was arrested and charged with Brian Ruff's murder on the 19th of September 2005. In 2007, he accepted a plea deal and pleaded guilty to the lesser charges of manslaughter and kidnapping. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. As for his second wife, Crystal, her murder case remains unsolved to this day. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. A woman called a moving company in New York and suddenly realized something was terribly wrong. The employee who answered the phone told her that her 8-year-old daughter, Eliza, never showed up for work that day. At first, the woman said nothing. Then her breathing changed. Her voice started trembling. And before hanging up, she quietly said she needed to call 911 immediately. Just moments earlier, she had walked into her house and found the entire place destroyed. Furniture overturned. Papers scattered everywhere. And upstairs, behind a locked bedroom door, was something waiting that would horrify detectives for months to come. That night, the 10th of August 2005, investigators in New York began looking into what appeared to be a violent home invasion. But as the evidence started coming together, they realized the killer wasn't a stranger who broke into the house. The killer was someone who had already been standing beside the family the entire time. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please tell the like button. You'll save them a seat at the movies, but then you put your code on it instead. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early afternoon of Wednesday, the 10th of August 2005, 8-year-old Eliza Parsi was sitting on her bed in her Staten Island home, flipping through a fashion magazine. The house was quiet. Her mother, Seema, was at work, so Eliza had the place to herself until her own shift started later. Eliza had just graduated high school a few months earlier and was working as a clerk at a moving company. She was saving up for college, but her real dream was to move into Manhattan and work in the fashion industry. Still, she felt a little guilty about leaving. It would mean her mom would be all alone in the big house. Eliza's parents, who were both from Israel, had divorced about a year and a half before. Her father had moved back to Israel, leaving just her and her mom in New York. Eliza did have 2 older half-brothers from her mom's first marriage. One was also in Israel. The other, her 7-year-old half-brother Raviv, lived a short drive away. But they rarely saw him. Raviv was married with a new baby and was in charge of the family's struggling kosher cookie business. He was always busy, always stressed about money, and just didn't make it out to Staten Island much. Eliza got to the last page of her magazine and saw it was time to get ready for her 2 p.m. shift. But first, she wanted to check her messages on her online dating profiles. So she went over to her desk and logged into her computer. Back in 2005, internet dating was just taking off, and Eliza had made a few profiles to see what would happen. She'd started messaging and meeting up with men from all over the city, but she kept it a secret from her mother. She knew Seema wouldn't approve of her dating men who weren't from their Orthodox Jewish faith. Eliza knew this for a fact because it had happened with her last boyfriend, Hassan. He was a Muslim boy she'd met at her public high school. Her family had completely disapproved of the relationship because of his religion. The pressure became too much, and Eliza eventually broke up with him. So now, she was much more secretive. She'd make up excuses to go to other neighborhoods when really she was going on dates. She had even started secretly bringing some of the guys back to her house, always sneaking them in through the back door when her mom was at work. Eliza saw a few new messages and replied to them. Then she headed into the bathroom to take a shower. A few minutes later, she turned off the water and heard a noise from outside the bathroom. She'd heard a landscaping crew next door earlier, but this was different. It was a weird banging sound. Thinking it might just be the landscapers next door, Eliza stepped out of the shower and wrapped a towel tightly around herself. Then, she slowly opened the bathroom door to see where the noise was coming from. But someone was already inside the house. That night, around 7:30 p.m., Eliza's mother, Seema, got home. She put her key in the front door, but it would only open a few inches. Something was blocking it. Confused, Seema shoved against the door until she could squeeze inside. The first thing she saw was that a heavy mirror had been propped against the door. Before she could process why, she turned on the lights and saw her living room was completely destroyed. Furniture was overturned, cabinets were open, and papers were everywhere. Seema immediately felt her heart start pounding. Someone had broken into the house. But then another thought hit her. Where was Eliza? Seema knew her daughter had been home. She started calling out her name, but there was no answer. She ran upstairs and saw that the door to Eliza's room was closed. She tried the handle, but it was locked. This was wrong. Eliza never locked her door. In a panic, Seema banged on the door, screaming Eliza's name. But there was only silence. She pulled out her phone and called the moving company. When Eliza's boss told her she'd never shown up for work, Seema's stomach dropped. With trembling hands, she hung up and dialed 911. About an hour later, Detective Michael Kenny of the NYPD arrived. The street was swarming with neighbors, and yellow crime scene tape was stretched across the front yard. He parked and walked to the house, where two patrol officers met him. They told him they'd responded to a robbery call, had to break down a locked bedroom door, and inside, they found the body of one 8-year-old Eliza Parsi. The officers said the whole house was torn apart, but they couldn't find any sign of a forced entry. They pointed to Seema, who was standing nearby with a young man. Kenny knew he'd have to talk to her, but first, he needed to see the scene for himself. Inside, the living room was a mess, but Kenny noticed that valuable items like the TV and stereo were sitting out in the open, untouched. That was unusual for a burglary. He went upstairs to Eliza's room. It was also ransacked. Clothes were everywhere, and the mattress was pulled off the bed, leaning against a wall. In the middle of the floor was Eliza's body. She was naked, with a towel bunched up underneath her. Kenny asked a crime scene tech if this was how they found her. The tech said no. When they first arrived, Eliza had been underneath the mattress with a pillow over her face. They had to move both to examine her. Kenny knelt down but couldn't see an obvious cause of death, no bullet or knife wounds. This suggested she might have been suffocated, maybe with that pillow. He asked if they'd found any signs of injury. The tech pointed to a few tiny drops of blood on the towel. They were small and could have been old. But all the details, a naked young woman, the mattress, the pillow, the blood, made Kenny suspect she had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. He told the tech to collect the blood and any other fluids as evidence. A few minutes later, Kenny went outside to speak with Seema. She was crying on the shoulder of a young man who immediately stepped forward when he saw Kenny. He demanded to know why they couldn't see Eliza and why the police weren't out arresting her killer. Kenny took a deep breath. This was clearly Eliza's brother, and his anger was understandable. Kenny calmly explained that to find the killer, he needed information, starting with where he and Seema had been that day. The man lowered his voice and introduced himself as Raviv. He and Seema both said they had been at work all day and had alibis. Kenny then asked if they knew anyone who would want to harm Eliza. He saw them exchange a knowing glance. Raviv immediately said Kenny should look into her ex-boyfriend Hassan. Sema added that just a few weeks ago, Eliza had woken up to find Hassan sitting at the end of her bed, just staring at her. She said it terrified Eliza, who had no idea how he'd gotten inside. Before Kenny could ask another question, Raviv suddenly started yelling at someone across the yard. "Get out! We don't want you here." Kenny turned and saw a teenage boy standing there, looking scared. Raviv then turned back to Kenny and yelled at him to arrest that boy, Hassan, because he was the one who killed Eliza. Late that night, Detective Kenny sat in an interrogation room with Hassan. So far, Hassan had been cooperative, but he didn't have a solid alibi for the time Eliza was likely killed. Kenny had taken a DNA sample from him, as well as from Sema and Raviv, to compare against the evidence found at the scene. But DNA results took weeks back in 2005, so Kenny hoped for a confession. He asked Hassan if he had ever snuck into Eliza's house. Hassan didn't deny it. He admitted he had, but insisted he was just trying to talk to her to get back together. He said Eliza wasn't terrified, just annoyed, and told him to leave. Kenny noted the difference between Hassan's story and Sema's. He asked why Eliza's family disliked him so much. Hassan hung his head and said it was about religion. He was Muslim and they were Orthodox Jewish. Kenny wasn't sure what to believe. Was Hassan an obsessive ex-boyfriend, or were they just star-crossed lovers? Either way, he had a motive and a history of sneaking into her house. But with no confession and no hard evidence, Kenny had to let him go. The next day was Eliza's funeral, held so quickly due to Orthodox custom. Kenny had just received the autopsy report. It confirmed Eliza died from asphyxiation, likely smothered by the pillow. The medical examiner also found semen showing she'd had sex within 24 hours of her death and skin cells under her fingernails suggesting she fought back. But here was the twist. The report concluded the sex had been consensual. There were no signs of sexual violence. This meant the killer was likely a romantic partner, which seemed to clear her family. But it also didn't seem to be a random burglar since nothing was stolen. At the synagogue, Kenny saw two groups, members of the Orthodox community and Eliza's friends from school. He stood in the back of the men's section and watched. The atmosphere was solemn. Then, suddenly, the energy in the room shifted. Everyone turned to look at the entrance. It was Hassan. He was trying to make his way to the casket. Raviv saw him, marched straight over, shoved him, and yelled at him to get out. Before a fight could break out, other men separated them and escorted Hassan out of the building. 2 weeks later, on August 24th, Kenny was with the NYPD computer crime unit. Eliza's friends had told him about her secret online dating life. The IT specialists dug into her computer and found a message thread with a man named Jonathan. They were making plans to meet at her house for sex on August 9th, the day before she was killed. Eliza told him to come to her house while her mom was at work and that she'd leave the back door unlocked so he could sneak in. This plan matched the crime scene perfectly. Kenny tracked Jonathan down. He admitted he'd gone to her house and they'd had consensual sex, but he insisted he never went back to Staten Island after that. He gave a DNA sample without hesitation. Weeks passed, and the case went cold. Kenny had nothing solid on Hassan or Jonathan. Then, on September 13th, the medical examiner called. The DNA results were in. The semen sample didn't match the skin cells under Eliza's fingernails. There was DNA from two different men. The semen belonged to Jonathan, confirming his story of consensual sex the day before. The skin cells found under Eliza's fingernails from her desperate fight for her life belonged to her half-brother, Raviv. Raviv was angry at his mother. The family cookie business she'd passed to him was failing, and he felt humiliated living in his in-laws' basement with his wife and new baby. He knew Sema had money from her recent divorce, money he felt was rightfully his. So on August 10th, instead of driving his delivery route, he went to his mother's house to steal it. He didn't know Eliza's work schedule had changed and that she would be home. Before searching the house, Raviv dragged a heavy mirror in front of the front door, creating a barricade in case someone unexpectedly came home. When he went into Eliza's room, he was shocked to find her coming out of the bathroom. He knew she would tell their mother what he was doing. In a panic, he tackled her, smothered her with a pillow until she stopped fighting, and then staged the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. He then left, only to return hours later after his mother called him, pretending to be a grieving brother. Raviv eventually pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. In the end, the person demanding justice the loudest outside the crime scene was the same person who had killed Eliza only hours earlier. Raviv had publicly blamed Hassan, comforted his grieving mother, and stood beside detectives pretending to mourn his sister. But the entire time, the killer had already been there. Hours earlier, when Seema called Eliza's workplace searching for her daughter, Eliza was already dead inside the house. And the person she should have been safest around turned out to be the one she needed protection from most. Thanks for listening. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments below. If you want to watch more true crime stories, check out the playlist linked on screen. Until next time.